Wilderness. Wild lands. Places where the roar of traffic, the incessant rumble of machinery, and the clamor of voices demanding more, now, are silenced. Places where the soul can find air to breathe and time to heal. Wild lands. One small boy from Dunbar, who was once described as the most famous Californian of all time. The most famous Californian! Hasta la vista, baby! April the 21st, 2004. Arnold Schwarzenegger, governor of California. Nearly 90 years after his birth, the evocative reflections of conservationist John Muir continue to inspire the citizens of our state and nation to appreciate and reflect and respect our natural heritage. An appreciation of John Muir by President Theodore Roosevelt. That night, we camped in a grove of sequoias. It was clear weather and we lay in the open. The enormous cinnamon trunks rising above us like the columns of some vaster, more beautiful cathedral than was any ever created by any human architect. All next day, we traveled through the forest. Then a snowstorm came on. And at night, we camped on the edge of Yosemite under a magnificent silver fir. President Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir, a campfire, a silver fir, blankets, dreaming of the dawn of the 20th century under the magnificent sequoias, while the city of San Francisco dreamed of flooding Hetch Hetchy, one of the greatest valleys of the Yosemite National Park. Christmas Eve, 1914. John Muir is lying in a hospital bed, dying of pneumonia, grieving for Hetch Hetchy and the plunderers of planet Earth.
What an opportunity we have in front of us to celebrate the legacy of John Muir and to celebrate 21 years of success by the John Muir Trust. This is a great time for us to do that. And I want to make sure that all of you realize that this is not just a Scottish event, and it's not just an international event. This here, the next 2 days, is a global event. I think that the things that we're going to be speaking about and learning about and talking about will be spread not throughout Scotland, not throughout maybe Europe or this part of the world, but throughout all of the world.
In 10 weeks, the United States Mint will start minting and distributing all across the United States a new quarter, 25-cent piece. It has still the picture of Thomas Jefferson on the front, but on the back is a son of Scotland and the mountains in Yosemite that he loved. As was alluded to before, several times in the last decade, the California Historical Society has conducted a survey among the people of California to determine the most famous Californian in history. And it isn't Ronald Reagan, and it isn't Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's this same Scotsman, John Muir. You probably don't know that pursuant to California law, every April 21st, the governor proclaims for the entire state that the day is John Muir Day. Muir didn't invent conservation any more than Henry Ford invented the automobile. But Ford popularized a radically new concept in transportation, Muir popularized a radical new concept in land use, the concept of wild land preservation for its own sake. He's an inspiration to people who are today striving to protect the natural environment from threats Muir could not have even imagined in even his wildest dreams. Toxic waste, acid rain, ozone depletion, groundwater contamination, mass destruction of tropical rainforests, extinction of whole species, and more.
My task this morning is to introduce you a little further afield around the world, to look really at what's happening in wildland, where it exists. I'm moving down over the Andes now to show you one particularly beautiful place, going down to the country of Chile, down the coast, into the remote fjords south of Puerto and north of the Beagle Channel. And down here, close in deep fjords, are some of the most spectacular last remaining southern beech forests in the world. Extraordinary diverse woodland, plenty of Arctic alpine flowers in the understory, a place with most exceptional species. And it is up here that a Canadian aluminium smelting works has recently been established because of deep water harbours and the secrecy of a ghastly operation for taking aluminium back to Canada to make soft drink cans. I think time's running out. I think we should absolutely examine what we do. I think we should absolutely pay the price for it. I think we should be taxed. I think we should, as intelligent nations, cancel the debt. Bring water to Africa. Bring all our resources to bear on the subject of AIDS across the world. I think we should pay the price.
We revel in the sort of soul-searching as we point fingers around the world at what's happening and admit certainly that we are part of the problem. The EU's ecological footprint scans the globe. But when we come to think about what we can do, we must start at home. And I think the EU is now arguably in the lead internationally in terms of commitment to biological work and conservation of nature. In all of this, what is your share of the problem? Are you part of the solution, or are you something on the fringe? I put that in as a little bit of a provocation. Many people would say this is something for the elitists, this is something for the well-heeled middle class. You're arguing for the things you like. There is a schizophrenia here because you're arguing to protect wild lands and wilderness, but you get there in your four-wheel drive cars, and in doing so you ruin the environment and cause global change. And my final absolute piece of provocation: nobody can claim to have wilderness without wolves. I didn't say that, well I did, but let's not quote me. I think a mark of our society's true maturity and our true embracing of the values of nature and wildlife is finding space for species like the wolves.
We've had three very complimentary and thought-provoking presentations. Certainly for me, one of the key themes that came out is the role of people in all of this to do with wildland, whether that be local people, whether it be active citizens, whether it be tourists, whether it be consumers and everything that goes with that.
Any comments? Who wants to start us off? Yes, right at the back, please.
Nicholas referred a lot to the Nature 2000 sites, and there's obviously a lot of correlation between wildland and the Nature 2000 sites. Is there some form of EU directive that we could push for that would help us to put pressure on governments to respect the wildland that we have?
Well, I think when we're looking at the arguments for new directives, we have to think about whether or not what we already have in place is doing the job. And I would say, as we move forward with the full implementation of the Habitats and Birds Directive, you saw the map, 18% is not a bad slice of the territory to actually have a significant influence on. So many of the areas that you would want to have protected under some kind of wildland directive if we were starting afresh are actually identified as Natura 2000 sites.
It's rather extraordinary that when I started doing my research on wilderness in Scotland, I went down to Dunbar in about 1971, and I could hardly find anyone who'd ever heard of John Muir. The coming of the John Muir Trust was only part of a wider picture of development of particularly recreation, wildland related organisations, and of course it revitalised the whole process of land acquisition and conservation by voluntary bodies. One of the things I would like to stress is that we sometimes have something of an inferiority complex in Scotland about the scale and extent of our wild country. We have, if you look at that map, we have 11 units of areas more than 500 square kilometres, where the core of those areas is 3 hours from a public road. Now, comparing apples with oranges, these units are larger than the average in the American wilderness system if you set aside the area in Alaska, which is nearly 55% of the total coverage. So we do have some pretty serious wild country.
We may have very little wilderness in the pure dictionary sense of the word here in Scotland. But ask anyone, go out in the street there in Pitlochry, go into Glasgow or the streets in Edinburgh and ask anybody, and they'll tell you we've got wild land in Scotland. And they'll probably tell you we've got lots of wild land in Scotland. From the Tolkien-esque scenery of Hoy in the Orkneys, to the big buxom rolling hills. You're dying to see the big buxom hills, eh? of the Grampians, to the rugged, tumbled, rough bounds of Neudat. Yeah, we're getting there. Or the secluded, mysterious, wonderful splendour of Sandwood Bay, owned, of course, by the John Muir Trust. All different, each special in its own way, with its own attributes and associated flora and fauna. And then there's the jagged, ragged peaks of the Skye Coulin. So completely different to anything else in Scotland. And I'd go as far as to say, so completely different to anything else in Europe. I would argue the Coulin is perhaps Scotland's most iconic mountain range. The potential sale of which made many of us re-examine this whole question of the value of such landscapes. You know, when John MacLeod of MacLeod put these mountains on the open market for a cool £10 million, we were cruelly reminded that land in Scotland is still generally valued on economic grounds. Can we, perhaps as a nation, begin to shrug off this Western anthropocentrism? Can we cast aside our urban notions that man is dominant and begin perhaps to understand something of the intrinsic value of wild land? And in these days of human rights, we hear a lot about human rights. I wonder if we can perhaps even reach an understanding that mountains and hills and forests and lakes and rivers and the creatures and the plants that live there have rights in themselves. Huh? And if we don't, then we'll never be able to protect our wild lands from the problems that they face today.
I'm a dollar to be on the hill. Ek hoor as Ian New, agus am trying to good again, agus am got as could be but agus a heleboel lekker. I did that in Brussels last year when I was speaking to a group from Denmark, and when the mayor of Storstrom stood up at the end to thank me, he started by saying, "Thank you very much, Donald, and thank you particularly for speaking to us in our own language." And then realised that they thought I was speaking Danish and that I got the guttural sound right, and my pronunciation was all in the shop and he didn't understand a word of what I was saying. Anyway, I survived the experience, and to this day he thinks I was speaking Danish. Anyway, I'm just going to tell you a bit about my upbringing on that island of Skye in the 1950s and 60s. I suppose you could call Scariff a wild island rather than a wild land. When I was growing up there, we had a population of less than 50. We had, I think, 19 households, lots of them, 1 or 2 people in each house, as you can imagine, older people. And we had no electricity, no running water, no roads, no modcoms, no fridges, no freezers, no women, no televisions, no cars, that sort of thing. It was really genuinely a subsistence economy. 1960s came, lots more tourists came, and what I mean by lots more tourists would be maybe 20, 30 in a summer, something like that. And one of the people who came along at that time was a bloke called Gatcliffe, and he got an old croft house on Scariff when people were leaving, and they started encouraging youth hostelers to come along to it. And some of them, the log book for the youth hostel is still available, and it's got some great comments in it, like one person saying, you must publicise this place, it's a fantastic place, you must tell everybody in the world about it. And the next hostler saying, no, don't do that. It's the dilemma of multitude versus solitude.
I think it's probably without exception, everybody in this room is committed to the value of wild land. The question now is, how do we get it more firmly onto the policy agenda? And what do we want that policy agenda to be? Although there is one point I'd like to pick up from this morning, which was about the possibility of a wildland directive. One thing I would point out is that what we are hopefully on the brink of is the UK ratifying the European Landscape Convention. Now that isn't an EU matter, it's a Council of Europe initiative. And it's certainly not wholly about wild land, it's about landscape in the round. But nonetheless, if that happens, I think it will provide a significant platform for those of us who are interested in wildland to try and get greater attention paid to it. And that, I suppose, brings me on to the wider picture. What do we have to do to get political attention for this particular cause? First of all, I think there is a need to highlight and reinforce the linkages between wildland, tourism and other activities. We need to underline the fact that wildland really is an asset, and increasingly an asset. If, as I think we're all agreed, through a process of cumulative attrition, not just in Scotland, but almost everywhere in the developed world, there is less and less wildland, then it is very important that people recognise that a declining asset becomes potentially more and more valuable economically.
Earlier in the discussion there was a mention of conservation and education in schools and everything. How come, even though with all this education and great opportunities, am I the only child here today?
I can only wish there were another 10,000 of you. That would be great to see, because obviously if we're going to preach conservation as a message, it's got to start with people like you.
It would be interesting to know if there are any school teachers here today.
We have here a school teacher down the second row here who's probably taken thousands of young people out to the wild places.
I'll talk about that too. I had 2 4-year-olds up Ben Lomans.
Fantastic.
The whole school were invited to go up Ben Lomans. And my husband and I and 2 friends took any children who wanted to come with their parents. And over the Glasgow Herald headline, 4-year-olds climb Ben Lomans.
Yeah,
and if 4-year-olds can do it, anybody can do it.
Absolutely.
And to me that was real education. They were taught the 3 R's thoroughly, but then they were taken to the hills and they knew Scotland by people who also knew Scotland. Yeah. And to me that is education.
What I want you to imagine is the island of Mull. Very beautiful day, beautiful morning, and in the company of Lettererick, we're walking in an area to wild land. And in front of us, about 25 yards away, there is a golden eagle. And there it was sitting just about there, and it sat and looked at us. And it sat and looked at us for about a good 10 seconds before it thought, that's enough of you, lifted its great wings into the air and floated off into the distance. And the comments that came from Leslie then were absolutely tremendous. She'll even tell you about it.
Well, this is a really fascinating topic, wildland. It's interesting because even as Dick mentions that on that occasion on Mull, we were on a bit of wild land. Well, were we actually? I mean, perhaps this is exactly where the conference comes in. Because we were, in fact, on an estate where the owner was threatening to shoot people with high-velocity rifles if they tried to, just, paid landowners relax. This was all going to be a happy, happy occasion later. This was a bad landowner, bad boy, untypical. But wild, I wonder, it was wild enough that it fitted Dick's test, which is there was a golden eagle. I can remember as we walked along, I saw a small ferny-looking bush in front of me, which suddenly took off. And at that point, Dick said, "That's a golden eagle." And I thought, no, that's a bush that has unaccountably moved into the air. And it was absolutely astonishing, and I remember it as vividly as yourself, Dick, now. What we're going to move through in this session is a feedback from the people who've been really talking to the stakeholders in wildland and managing it. And they're reporting now back on what they found as part of their deliberations and investigations. And we're going to move through 6 speakers.
If you think of the private landowner, and you could look inside his skull, or her skull, and you could see it mapped out as a sort of pie chart, economic utility would take up an awful lot of it. And then you'd have field sports for another segment, and then you'd have aesthetic pleasure and involvement with the people around whom he lives. So in a broad way, there are 2 kinds of private landowners: those who live on their estates and depend on them for a living. That very much applies to the farming community, as we heard yesterday. And those for whom the estate is a machine for pleasure and retreat. Landowners and farmers, particularly the first category, may seem rather conservative, but actually in practice we adopt new practices remarkably quickly with a bit of financial incentive. But what about the sporting estates? What about people who must be nameless, but who are extremely wealthy, have enormous estates, and for whom the sort of financial motivations given, sort of produced by different grant incentives and things like that, really don't apply at all. They couldn't care less whether they don't care about something like premiums or single farm payments or anything. That's immaterial, and their place is their place. And I guess that the wicked landowner. But I rather like that there should be some bogies in the closet, as they might say in America, because where are we without scapegoats and naughty people? And a world where there is no, well, I will mention a name, but what will we do when Lord Burton has gone? I can't tell you how distressed and disappointed you'll be. There won't be that naughty old man, God bless his soul.
Pressures on wildland. Well, these were reviewed very well yesterday. Deforestation, burning, grazing issues. But I think for many outdoor recreationists, it's the visual intrusion which is has attracted the greatest concern. Hydroelectric schemes of the past, bulldoze roads of the more recent past, deer fencing, downhill skiing, and now, of course, we have the proliferation of telecommunication masts and this relentless spread of wind turbines, giving an impression of attrition and loss. So let's look to the future, and we think it's very important to really have a clear perspective on the way forward and to have some achievable targets. And it must be related very much to the political agenda, and it's the political agenda of today, not what we hoped what might have been. And politicians like to talk about jobs, and Highlands and Islands Enterprise did some excellent work a few years ago where they identified that £150 million per annum was being brought into the Highland economy through walking and climbing, and we need more research of that sort which links the financial value of Scottish wildland to its associated outdoor recreational activities. Politicians are worried about climate change, and that's expressed to them so often in the costs of associated with changing rainfall patterns and especially river flooding. We need to lift their eyes to the hills and to really convince them that a major objective should be to increase the water retention capacity of our hill ground. And that means putting in place much more sensible grazing regimes in order to increase the sponginess of the hills, to encourage regeneration of scrub and woodland vegetation. We need new arrangements for deer control, which are based on present-day needs, not on those when Queen Victoria was on the throne.
Is wildland a resource which should be sustained, and if so, why? Again, no disagreement on this proposition, which is good news for ways ahead. The social and economic benefits of this resource appear to be quite widely recognised, most obviously gained by bodies with tourism and recreation remits. SNH is of the clear view that this resource is worthy of protection, and our policy statement is intended to provide impetus to this objective. It highlights the value of such areas under 5 broad categories: scarcity of land, of this type of land on a European scale. Because it's all around us in Scotland doesn't mean it's all around everyone in Europe, and I think it's really worth remembering that. The intrinsic value of such areas, intrinsic quality, which was much talked about yesterday in a very inspirational way, their potential for nature, the economic value, and value for open-air recreation. And also I'd like to note from that quote by Visit Scotland, the wider cultural significance, echoing the point, made by Visit Scotland, but also made by other people over the years. In short, the answer to this question would therefore appear to be quite a resounding yes.
In what way is wildland important to your particular interest? And this is the community, remember. Exercise, escape, things that we would recognise there from our activities. The importance of wildlife and ecology, and an interesting one, national parks equate to national pride. Wildland in some cases was key to their particular organisation, and the principle of accessible land was essential for the local community and for its visitors. Also important, of course, to earn a living, and that was touched on by our first speaker. And some of the employment is indicated there: farmer, ranger, biologist, tourism, etc. Animals being vulnerable to predators from the wildland, and their income was consequently decreased. Wildland is important, and grazing from herbivores from wildland reduces foraging for our animals. Wild animals attract tourists and thereby increase our income. And another interesting statement that perhaps sums up the balance that we're seeking: we aim for an area of diverse, flourishing habitats with their full potential of native flora and fauna, supporting a thriving local community.
We have an exceptional diversity of wildlife and scenery in this country, really probably second to none. And we really try and promote that. It's extremely important, particularly for people from abroad as well, who maybe don't really know that much about Scotland, that we get that message over. And 16-70% of tourists will undertake a wildlife activity while they're on holiday. So that's actually quite a large number. I think it's essential that we actually encounter people that have actually little understanding as well as a great understanding. And city dwellers, town dwellers, country dwellers, we all have a very, very different view of actually what wildland is. It means different things to different people. And that's where I really am coming from, is that we need to be wary of that, because a wild place to someone from the city can just be the hill at the back of their city or town, and because it's covered in trees you don't see anyone, it's quiet, it's tranquil. It can give you that wild sense. It's extremely important to understand people, where they come from, and how they interpret wild in their own sense.
See, the problem is, if there is a problem about our use of energy, then you may think Scottish Power is the problem. In fact, it's all of us. We are profligate in our use of the world's resources, energy not least. One example: by the end of this century, if we do nothing, 20% of the land area of Bangladesh will be underwater. 117 million environmental refugees. And if you can all sit there comfortably and think that immigration quotas is the answer, at about the same time, the coastal strip communities of the Knoydart Peninsula will also be washed away. So what do we do about it? I'm not going to stand here and say that building wind farms by itself is the answer. I'm not going to stand here and say that energy efficient light bulbs, loft insulation, switching off our lights, whatever else is by itself enough. We must do everything we can in our power to tackle climate change. If not, I hope you can sleep at night. And I'll pose you a false dichotomy. If building wind turbines across Scotland's wild land could save a small proportion of that land in Bangladesh, then in the words of Billy Bragg, which side are you on? Now that's a false dichotomy, of course, because here comes the good news at the end. I do not think, to meet the current targets for renewable energy in this country, that we need to build a single wind farm on wild land according to the maps that I saw yesterday. And I want to work, Scottish Power, the whole organisation wants to work with John Muir Trust to try and see if we can deliver on that. I will give you an example. We must build 1,000 megawatts of renewable energy by the end of this decade. And at the moment we have about 950 megawatts going through the planning process, all in commercial Sitka spruce forestry plantations.
We've all heard a lot in the last couple of days. It seems like we always keep defaulting back to the same old question, which is, what is wilderness? And, oh dear, I've had that conversation many, many times. And I thought it'd be really interesting to maybe look at that question from a completely different perspective. Look at it from the perspective of the soul. There was a discussion, a session about earth jurisprudence, which is a wonderful idea. It says that we sit in our the little bubble of our own human societies and we invent laws so that we can all live together. But if we go and look at the earth will give us all the structures and constraints and all the laws that we need are right there in these wild ecosystems. And if we go and look at that, we can learn perhaps a lot of lessons about how we might live. And the chances are that if we use that kind of legal system, we'll live sustainably.
Welcome to JMTV.
Right here, right now, right here, right now, right here, right now, right here, right now.
Good afternoon, I'm Gordon Bonner, and this afternoon's opening edition of JMTV, we're going to be looking at the main educational initiative of the Trust.
Something called the John Muir Award.
As you might expect, the John Muir Award reflects its namesake in lots of ways, besides having the same name. It too was born in Dunbar, not in a hospital with a midwife, but in a leisure centre with Lord Lindsay, the Minister of the Environment at the time. In the same way that Muir spread the message of ecology and conservation to the wider audiences, from those humble origins in 1997, with 6 organisations trying it out, over 17,000 awards have now been achieved. And the staff team of one amateur enthusiast has now expanded to a finely honed, highly skilled, dedicated team of crack Muir commandos committed to putting the John Muir Award on the map in the UK.
Looking back over the 21 years, it's hard really to believe that the Trust could have grown into what it is today from the very tenuous beginnings that it had. We spend a lot of time debating wildland and wilderness, and a lot of this conference has done that. But 21 years ago, the word wildland was virtually taboo. It was not a word that could be used in these discussions. The paper which set out the original idea for the John Muir Trust was called Wildland and Trust. And the people at that time who were thinking of a new trust were thinking obviously of the name for it. And the first thoughts they had were to call it Wildland and Trust, or Scottish Wildland Trust, or just Wildland Trust. But it was felt that that would convey at the time the wrong message to people, that people, the public, would see the Trust as just being a lot of wild people with wild ideas and wild ways of doing things. And indeed, maybe they were right. The idea was simple 21 years ago. It was to create a new body which was dedicated to caring for wilder and remoter places in this country, valuing them for their own sake, as well as for the human joy of experiencing wilderness and the sheer beauty of nature untrammeled.
Wildland ultimately is a state of mind, but it's only a few very precious places that make that state of mind possible. Why on earth, you will obviously be thinking, is a politician, for heaven's sake, talking about poetry and soul and beauty and a sense of the infinite and the inspiration that we can have from landscape. Well, sometimes politics and the business of government ought to reach out to things beyond the everyday. We ought to recognise that the process of politics and understanding our society is not just about caring for physical well-being and financial security and social order, important though those things are. But it's also about enabling people to have spiritual aspiration and making sure that the things of the natural world that permit and foster that spiritual aspiration are there and will still be there in order to carry on doing it. These are not things that should be on the periphery of government. These are not things that should be seen as far outside the mainstream of what we talk about. They are surely central to the human experience. And politics, above all, should understand and recognise that.
So lots of common ground, and I think lots of willingness to talk. I think that we need to develop a bit more willingness to listen, and hopefully, the dialogue can continue.
Today, we don't need another John Muir. We need an army of John Muirs. We need thousands of people with his vision, his spirit, his commitment to be the voice of wilderness and wildlands around the world. Just last year, I did have the privilege of attending the 5th World Parks Congress in Durban. It was a great once-in-a-decade event. Many impressive people addressed the delegates. Queen Noor of Jordan, Nelson Mandela. But I believe, and many others I spoke to there agreed, that the two most impressive people who addressed the Congress the whole time were two young black teenagers from South Africa, a young man and a young woman. They addressed the delegates at the very beginning of the conference. These young people spoke with the fervor, the poise, and the courage of John Muir. They had spoken powered by the clarity of youth and made us feel more personally accountable for conservation actions and inactions.
I began to know the Cairngorms at an age that I can't actually remember, but I can see that I was there because my parents took photographs. One day in Ballater, a rainy day when we were on holiday, I picked out this pale blue book called The Cairngorm Hills of Scotland by Seton Gordon. It was almost like switching on an electric light inside my head. This book and his writing painted a picture of a wonderland, mysterious, beautiful. The wildlife, the places themselves, the weather, the Gaelic names, the people that lived there were all a different world to me, and I wanted to be in it. We as mankind have the power to dominate the earth. We are dominating the earth. We're driving thousands of other species to extinction, and we're endangering our own survival by our actions. It's important that we as people who have this power leave some places for Mother Nature, because we only share the planet, even though we dominate it. I didn't set out to achieve anything. If I've written anything or taken photographs or left publications which other people think are useful, then that's good enough for me. I must say at the same time, though, it's all too easy to drift into cosy feeling where you don't want to get involved in controversy. And it's a nice day, so you want to go and take a walk in the hill. But we owe it to our self-respect and to the eagle and the wild places to do more. The UK and devolved governments must actively demonstrate that they recognise the importance of wild land and wild places as part of our national heritage by 1. Supporting and encouraging people of all ages and backgrounds to experience wild places to improve their health and spiritual well-being. 2. Supporting local communities by developing a new, broader range of grants and incentive schemes to help restore and enhance wild land. 3. Reviewing planning policy and legislation to ensure that the protection and enhancement of wild land are strengthened. 4. Establishing a forum to agree a national strategy for the appropriate siting of renewable energy developments. 5. Ratifying the Council of Europe's Landscape Convention and embracing its responsibility to protect our wild land heritage. Finally, we must all involve future generations in the care of wild land and wild places. We must all take personal responsibility for reducing energy consumption and our impact on the planet. To take things forward, we must all work together. This declaration for the wild will be delivered to government ministers on behalf of the conference by the John Muir Trust. Thank you all for your input.